Today we're just going to be doing an introduction to a larger course, as Todd mentioned, and we're going to be doing a little bit of questioning and answer during this introduction. If you could save any major questions if something's unclear until the break or the end, that would be great. But if I do put up a slide and ask a question, then it is nice if you can, type in some answers and we can get a little bit of dialogue. One of the things we're going to really try to do with the full course is make it very interactive instead of me just talking to you, trying to get you involved in the material, and that includes giving you some homework actually or at least cases to contemplate before the class, just to start thinking about the material. Not that it's required for the CEUs or anything, but it's more just for your learning. So today we're just going to go through kind of a history of who Bowei was, what this method is, some of the key players historically and from China, who Dr. Wu was, who helped me with the book that I wrote, and almost more importantly, though, is what are treatment principles? Why are they important to us to understand? Why are they important historically, and how they fit in with what's happening in China and TCM now, and why they're important to me clinically? And then about halfway through, or at the very end, I would say maybe 3/4 way through, we're going to look at just a little exploration of some classical formula like Xiao Chai Hu Tang, and see how we can deepen our understanding and our usage through looking at treatment principles. So this course is a little bit more on the historical side. I'm going to try to integrate some useful clinical knowledge. The overall course is pretty much 100% clinical, but this is just kind of setting the stage and the background for that material. It's really trying to teach, a thinking method, how to think precisely in the clinic, and that really comes down to first getting a solid diagnosis. And one thing we'll be talking about today is it's not about diagnosing diseases per se, or even patterns, but really the individual presentation, and that's where I think the essence of Bowei's method is, and what it really teaches you, and what a lot of us actually yearn for in our clinical practice. We'll be talking a lot about Pao, which is herbal processing in the course, as well as lots of case studies in the course. We're not going to get into a lot of that today, but we will see a little bit of that. And we'll also be integrating a lot of classical formulas into modern knowledge, or modern takes on those formulas, and how Bowei thought about them and used them as part of the course as a whole. Okay. So, as I said, I graduated from PCOM, and I have the same education as probably most everyone out there that's listening to this, a pretty standard Western education. I learned the basics of Chinese medicine, and I feel like it got me a really good start in learning how to treat people. But I got into the clinic, and I really started to wonder what the difference was the way that I was practicing compared to a lot of the famous physicians that I started to read about in some Chinese textbooks and Chinese, case study books. And I noticed that although TCM is somewhat rooted in classical thought, a lot of these famous physicians just had a slightly different take on how to integrate and use kind of this pre-modern knowledge. I'm going to talk a lot about that today, like what's pre-modern, and did Mao Zedong have a certain type of influence on Chinese medicine or not? We're going to be looking at that a little bit. But I noticed that these doctors had a very fluid and non-confining way of treating. It enabled them to address unique presentations very easily and very simply, actually. And this interests me a lot because I wasn't really practicing that way when I graduated, and I just had this question of, how do I break away from the simplistic textbook approach, which disease and which pattern and then, which formula. So I started to search for answers, and I started to read a lot of different Chinese texts. I actually just gravitated towards Bowei because there was a doctor in the office, Chip Chase, who actually translated some Bowei, and he recommended that I read some of his stuff because he has, huge textbooks and that he wrote. So I started reading that, and I also started traveling to China a bunch. So I've been to China maybe 10 times to study with various doctors, but there's one doctor in particular that I ran into on my second trip, and it really started to open things up to me and expose me to new ideas. And I met Dr. Wu, and his name's Wu Bo-ping, on the second trip. And actually, one of the first things that he asked me, he said, "Who do you like to read?" And coincidentally, I just, I like this guy Bowei. I had no idea that Bowei was even famous at that point. And Dr. Wu said that, oh, that was my teacher. So it was very synchronistic, and we got along really well from the beginning. And I want to tell you a little bit about who Dr. Wu was. He was one of Bowei's closest students. He also studied with a lot of other famous physicians, Zhao Bingnan, and Zhu Yan, and Ren Yinqiu. And he graduated in a very significant time. It was actually the very first class in Beijing of the Beijing College of Chinese Medicine in 1962. And he was in the same class as Wang Jui. Wang Jui is the doctor who Jason Robertson wrote his acupuncture book with. And this class was very unique because they started to study Chinese medicine, even though it was after Mao started influencing Chinese medicine a little bit. They didn't have any textbooks yet. And so they really didn't have this big influence of TCM on them, and they studied straight from classical texts. And Chen was teaching them straight from his material at the time, the material that we're going to look at today and through the course. And so he had a very unique education because the next year after that, the students that went in had a completely different education. So Wu Bo-ping started to travel the world teaching Chinese medicine. He was very good at speaking different languages, actually. He could speak English fairly well, so he actually taught in Siam, and he taught in London, and he held key positions in Hangzhou and Beijing and Munich. He had about 50 years of clinical experience, and his gift was his knack for explaining really complex ideas in a very straightforward manner. And this is actually something that Qin was really good at too, was see both of these guys able to take kind of the contradictions in Chinese medicine and start to distill them down into something very simple that we can use clinically. And that's really what we all want anyway. Sometimes we get wrapped up in the theoretical mind games, and really it's not necessary. So I started following Dr. Wu in the clinic, and one day I asked him what book that I should translate into English that would be good for the West. He was actually in his home, and he reached behind a bookshelf that he had there, and he had this book that was handwritten, that was wrapped up in some cloth, and pages were falling out. And it was one of the original textbooks for the 56 methods. And he said, "This is what I think you should translate." It was essentially, this version was lost in the Cultural Evolution. He said, really, there's nothing like it in English. It pretty much gathers and synthesizes the most important ideas in the history of Chinese medicine and puts it into one system. So it was very appealing when I heard that, if that's interesting. And he said that pretty much if you learn these methods, these 56 methods, then you can treat the vast majority of all diseases that come into your clinic. There were some that he said, can't be treated well without some additional methods. And like, for example, dermatology is a bit tricky with just using these methods. So there's some limitations. But the core methods do make up his dermatology treatments, but he just uses some other ideas also. He's actually a specialist. Dr. Wu is a specialist in dermatology and autoimmune and pretty complicated diseases. So as I started to look through the book, I realized that it is a bit of a missing link in the educational process. So we learn about methods or treatment methods or treatment principles. These are the same things. We see those in our books now, in our textbooks in the Materia Medica, but they're really underemphasized, and we're going to be looking at what that means and why that happens. But if we start to understand this missing piece, and we integrate it into what we already know, because we don't have to throw out what we already know, and this is important. This important thing to understand. It's really a complement to our education and to really any system of Chinese medicine. But we can start to just round it out by incorporating these treatment methods and principles. So this book up in the top left-hand corner, I'm going to try to see if I can get my arrow working. There we go. Was one of the original texts. This is actually a 1955 version, the one that we worked on together, Dr. Wu and I. The book here was from 1953. One of the important things to understand is there was lots of versions of this text. Bowei wrote the original material and then taught it to about 5,000 students, and it became kind of like a cultish type of textbook, and people, before they printed it, actually hand wrote the text. And what they did is they started to modify it through different things that Qin said, and we can see lots of different versions of the text throughout history. But the one that we worked on in the book is one of the original, is the cleanest version. So I just want to point that out. And then the textbook from Qin is actually very small. It's maybe 20 pages or so. And the book that we worked on with Wu ended up to be around 400 pages. And that's because of Dr. Wu's commentary. So he provided lots of really clinical, pearls and commentary to round out the book and show people in the West how to actually use the text. One of the things about Chinese texts is they keep things very simple and terse. And really, you have to figure it out for yourself. And it's very complicated if you don't have a very wide background of knowledge already. So what Dr. Wu did in the commentary is really break it down piece by piece so that it would be fairly easy to understand. And that's what this course hopefully will present to you guys. So one thing I like to do in the introduction is just look at a case study from Dr. Wu. We can go through this. You can start reading through it as I talk, but this case study is interesting to me because it's fairly straightforward in its diagnosis, but fairly complicated in his herb choices. This is one of his more complicated cases. And when you look at the herbs, when I first saw this type of case, it's kind of looks very chaotic and hard to understand. And then as I started to work through this material on my own, I've been, I think, using this material for about 8 years now. I started to realize there's a rhyme and reason to it. I'm not going to go through the details of this case because we're going to look at it in depth in one of the later classes, but I just want to present it here and you can look at it on your own, and you can see a lot of contradictory symptoms. And one of the elegance of most of these physicians, of Dr. Wu and Bowei and some other people we'll talk about in a minute, is they have this ability to kind of see through the contradictions and just write formulas that, in general, focus on one core idea. So this is the formula, and there's a couple things I like about it. If you look at on the right and you just see the type of herb that the category it's in, like regulate qi, clear damp heat, it actually looks very chaotic. Expel parasites down here at Binglang. Archo is a harsh expellant. And if you look back at the case and try to make sense of this, it's quite difficult. This formula is actually based off of 3 formulas that we're going to talk about in the course. And maybe you guys can try to figure out what formulas you might think that is. But this formula is actually quite straightforward. It makes quite a bit of sense. And something I would have never thought of graduating from school. And it's one of these kind of styles of writing which can treat a lot of really cool gastrointestinal, like chronic gastrointestinal problems. But also want to point out that you see all these different Chao, Jiao, Chao, 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 Da Huang Tan, Jiao Binglang, Chao Archos, a lot of Pao Jur. And in this course and a lot of the case studies we look at, there's a lot of Pao Jur being used, that herbal processing piece we're going to be learning about. And if you don't have access to these, we're going to talk about ways to still integrate the ideas of them. So you don't have to be using, raw bulk herbs and doing powder of all of these different herbs to utilize the ideas, but you can, and I want to expose you to some of these ideas. So this is just something you can look at for fun on your own and think about, and then later we'll get to, like why he does all of these herbs.